welcome everyone to our first Reinvent Australia webinar. My name is Angus Robinson. I'm the Secretary of Reinvent Australia, and I'm hosting this meeting for you all today. I'll be introducing our guest speaker, Paul Hodgson, very shortly. So without further ado, I have much pleasure in introducing our President, Dr. Graham Kenny, to make some welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Angus. And I do want to thank you, Angus, for setting this up. As usual, a great job and a lot of work in the background to get to this point. As you know, many of you will know that we were going to have this event in March. Things have interceded and we're now having this in May. So, Paul, thanks for being so flexible in making the time this afternoon. Paul, by the way, is in Brisbane. Angus and I are in Sydney. And I don't know where everyone else is, but we now, through this facility, can reach people from Cairns to Perth. And I think there's quite an exciting development for Reinvent Australia, where our reach is now national. And so we're looking to using this technology to grow our network, build our influence, and educate more people. There's nothing more for me to say, really, except one thing about the topic. It's Australian business opportunities from renewable energy. And we do stress the Australian business opportunities. And we wanted to get away from the argument about renewables or not. And boy, do we need some business opportunities at the moment. We're looking for new things in Australia, new manufacturing ideas, and many, many other ideas. So this is very, very timely, Paul. I thank you very much for leading us through this. I'm looking forward to a great session this afternoon. That's all from me, and I hope you all enjoy this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I'd just like to introduce Paul. Paul is the Brisbane-based GM, Innovation and Stakeholder Engagement for the East Coast for the National Energy Resources Australia Industry Growth Centre. He works with stakeholders to increase the productivity, competitiveness and export potential of the energy resources sector. Paul has qualifications in international business and sustainable development and has spent over 20 years exploring the competitiveness of businesses, industries and regions, and designing and implementing strategies to improve performance through innovation and collaboration. Paul, it's a great pleasure. We invite you to give us your presentation on these business opportunities to which Graham referred.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Angus, and thank you very much, Graham, for the opportunity to speak today. I'll just share my slides. It's quite interesting. I mean, you were saying about the reach of this. It's almost ironic, I suspect, that while there's some political argy-bargy in Australia happening about state borders, whether they should be open or closed, we're all sitting often at home at the moment and communicating around the world. In the last 24 hours, I've presented a hydrogen webinar for stakeholders in France. I did one this morning on hydrogen for stakeholders in Mackay, in Queensland, and this one is for Reinvent Australia. While in some ways we're being locked down, we're actually opening up, and the world's becoming even smaller and more connected. You know, it's a really interesting opportunity, I think, to talk about energy at the moment. I probably won't talk a lot about the current coronavirus pandemic and what that might mean, but it's a really interesting, extraordinary time, and you know, energy is something that we'll continue to use. So there may be some ups and downs, and we're not quite sure yet what the world will look like coming out of this, but I still think a lot of the discussion we'll have today will be, you know, quite insightful. Probably for a number of people that may not be aware of NERA, or National Energy Resource Australia, We're one of the federal government's industry growth centres. We're all independent organisations with our own industry boards, but we're really implementing the Industry Growth Centre initiative of the federal government, which has been around now for about 5 years, and is about identifying and strengthening the strategic competitive advantage of our priority sectors. And we're responsible for the oil, gas and energy resources sector. There's METS Ignited, which looks after mining equipment, technology and services. There's MTP Connect, that looks after medical technologies and pharmaceuticals. Food and agribusiness is looked after by FIAL, or Food Innovation Australia Limited, OST Cyber, Cybersecurity, and AMGC for advanced manufacturing. And we're really there to try and bring the best of Australia together. Really big advocates for collaboration, for innovation, for bringing the ecosystem together, and for really stoking a global ambition so that we don't just become the best in Queensland or the best in Sydney or the best in Western Australia, or even the best in Australia. We've become the best in the world in those areas of strategic competitive advantage. Each industry growth centre has a 10-year sector competitiveness plan. The energy sector is no different to other sectors, lots of change happening. So we do update it every year. We're just finalising our 2020 update at the moment, which will probably be out of date given the extraordinary times that we're in. But it really gives us an opportunity to reflect and review each year and to potentially tweak that roadmap over a longer period. Our vision is holistic and inclusive. Australia is a global energy powerhouse, a sought-after destination for investment and the leading source of knowledge and solutions. We are a global energy powerhouse, and I'll talk about that. We've got fantastic resources for energy, and we want, to develop more energy resources out of Australia. But we also want to be the leading source of knowledge and solutions. And sometimes we haven't amplified our supply chains, our technology, our research, and our knowledge to the global level, or at least into global markets. We do have a lot of world-class services and technology out of Australia, but it doesn't always make it into global markets, and that's something we spend a fair bit of time trying to improve. So before we sort of talk more about renewables, I mean, what I've found, and I've worked in the energy and the sustainability sector for probably almost 20 years now, and I find it quite frustrating that we often fight amongst ourselves in Australia about energy. But if you really look at the world and you look at global energy demand, which these figures of increasing by 25% didn't obviously take into account the current pandemic, but the world's wanting more energy. And if you look at Australia's energy sector and energy capabilities, whether they be natural capabilities or whether they be research or technology or training, we actually have, we're holding a handful of aces. We really do have opportunities to provide a wider sphere of technologies and energy sources to the world. We have natural advantages, strategic advantages in just about every part of the energy sector. And so that's why we're really quite keen to, to expand and diversify and grow Australia's energy sector. And this often comes as a surprise to people because, a lot of the renewables discussion in Australia has been very much about domestic electricity. But, as I said, we're a global energy economy. We export more than 2/3 of our annual production. And these are the last available statistics. They come out every year from the Australian government. If you look on a petajoule basis, we have 59% of our energy resources production in coal, 25% in oil and gas, and obviously we're the largest exporter of LNG now. 14% goes out as uranium oxide, and only 2% of our annual production of energy resources is everything else, including biomass, solar, wind, hydro. So it's still a very small piece. And this is despite Australia having, a very large landmass. I mean, I was talking to French stakeholders last night. Australia is 14 times larger than France, and France is not a small country by any stretch of the imagination. And we have pretty consistent wind resources across the country, and that's just on the landmass. We also have huge ocean wind potential as well as wave and tidal. And you can see that there, particularly down in Tasmania, up in far north Queensland, and along some of the coastal regions, particularly in the south, and across some of the high level areas, particularly across the Great Dividing Range. Really strong wind resources. I think the really key one is our solar radiation. So this is a map, and all these maps, I must say, are really available at nationalmap.gov.au. You can put in all sorts of overlays. A really great resource that's put out by the federal government, which probably more for an external audience, but it's really quite good if you're building these into your proposals to show people what the opportunity is in Australia. So you look at that solar radiation, there's very few places in the world with the sort of solar radiation levels. We're in the top 5 in the world, you know, up alongside people like the Northern Africa and the Sahara region, places like Morocco. So we've got a tremendous opportunity to unlock our renewable performance and get it way above 2% of our energy resource production. If we look at our greenhouse gas emissions, so 34% come out of electricity, the other 66% out of a whole range of other sources. And what we've tended to find is that we've had a very strong renewable push into electricity, but the other 66% may require other types of technology, renewables, things like renewable hydrogen, green ammonia, to unlock and to decarbonize other parts of our sector. And I'll talk a little bit about the growth I've seen in solar, particularly over the last 20 or so years. These figures only came out yesterday. This is last year's electricity generation by source. So we're still 56% of our electricity in Australia is generated by coal, but we saw an increase in both gas to 21% and renewables to 21%. The growth in solar generation in all up 46%. But the really interesting thing was that large scale solar was up 135% over 1 year. So I think it's quite interesting to see that the scale of the solar offerings have been getting bigger. And I would kind of suspect that they're going to get even bigger, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. On low emissions technologies, this week it's been quite a busy week. The federal government put out a technology investment roadmap on a framework to accelerate low emissions technologies, or I should add, they actually released a discussion paper. The first specific goal is producing hydrogen below $2 per kilogram. Submissions are due 21st of June. If anyone, and I'm sure a lot of people participating today would have a real interest in providing the government with some of their thoughts and ideas and evidence to prove up a framework for low emission technologies. And as I said to French stakeholders last night, there is, particularly on hydrogen, there's a real unity ticket. And I know people talk about perhaps the states are leading this. Well, you know, you look down this, this is a slide from Energetics, or an image from Energetics. And there's quite a consistency around emissions reductions, increases in renewable energy, increases in hydrogen right across the 6 states and 2 territories in Australia. And the 6 states, 2 territories and the federal government all came together to agree on a national hydrogen strategy in November last year. Here's a couple of slides I think are quite interesting. This one was a bit earlier in the year from Irena, the International Renewable Energy Agency, looking at the Australian deployment of renewables in various, this is watts per person per year. You can see we've had huge penetration, and we lead the world in penetration, particularly of rooftop solar systems. I think we've got more than 2 million household systems in Australia now. And that's what I would almost call the first wave of PV rollout or solar rollout was the smaller scale systems. And you know, we dwarf anyone else there in terms of watts per person per year. This is from the Clean Energy Council, as at last week, just the construction of large-scale renewable energy projects. So we're starting to see an increase in the size of solar systems. So we've the solar, I understand the small scale is still going well, but we've you know, we're now seeing large 100 hundreds or even hundreds of megawatts or gigawatts of solar farms being looked at. These are now kind of feeding the grid, creating potentially some issues around the curtailment of some of that solar energy, which I think is driving the people looking at not just hydro and batteries, but also the hydrogen economy as a way of storing and time shifting and place shifting in terms of potentially even export some of that great renewable energy that may be hitting, it's hitting the grid, but at a time when there's already an influx or an oversupply of energy. And there's quite a lot going on around the country, which mirrors the ambitions of all states and territories to increase their renewable energy investments. So I've started been thinking about a third wave. The first wave was the small scale, the second wave was the large scale, and the third wave is potentially export and industrial scale renewable energy projects. And I've just put a few here. There's many others, and probably a whole bunch that are still private because they're large operators that are building up their business cases internally. But I suspect most people on the line would have already heard of some of these projects. There's the Sun Cable project, which is looking at having a high voltage DC cable to Singapore, 10 gigawatts of solar from the Northern Territory. You've got the Asian Renewable Energy Hub in the Pilbara looking at 15 gigawatts of wind and solar, providing about 5 gigawatts of that into the iron ore producers in the Pilbara, but also looking to potentially export 10 gigawatts of that as hydrogen from northern Western Australia. There's the Murchison 5 gigawatt project in WA as well. There's also a Irena Renewable Energy Hub, which is a mix of solar and pumped hydro in North Queensland. And there's a number of these as well. And so I kind of think that in some ways the small scale got us probably to 10 to 20%. We're all sort of getting up to 25% of our national energy electricity market, so the grid, in terms of renewables. The large scale is probably going to help us get towards, maybe get up towards 100%. But the third wave is actually going to help us become a 200, 300, 500, 1,000% energy economy. I keep a renewable energy economy, and actually not only be able to help decarbonize Australia, but actually help decarbonize maybe Southeast Asia or the South Pacific, or even further afield into Northeast Asia, and even into Europe, and further afield by effectively what Dr. Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, talks about, exporting sunshine. So this I think is the third wave, and I think it's a very exciting wave. I think the business opportunities in this are going to be huge. And what we really want to do is make sure that we're building up the technology here. And we've got some fantastic technologies, some fantastic startups and small and medium enterprises, but we want to make sure that they continue to grow and that we're not actually just importing technology and running construction projects. So that's perhaps something we can have a discussion about in the Q&A. Talked about the National Hydrogen Strategy. I mean, the energy sector has been fraught with internal debate for a very long time. It's quite a unique experience almost for all states, territories, and the Commonwealth to agree on something, particularly in energy. And the National Hydrogen Strategy, I think, is quite a testament to that, but also to the opportunity for Australia that hydrogen has. Not only can it potentially help us decarbonise the 66% of our emissions that aren't in the electricity sector, but it can also help provide storage for our renewables, but it can also help us to export renewables as well. At the moment, why most of our energy production isn't in renewables is because we're exporting 2/3 of it, and we really haven't got a clear way of exporting those renewables at this point. And I think there's three aspects to what we want to do. We really want to export renewable energy. We want to export green products and services. So we want to build our manufacturing sector, reindustrialize, if you like, and potentially regain a competitive advantage in energy off of our massive renewable resources. but we also want to be able to help commercialise technologies and services and knowledge out of Australia in renewable energy as well to the rest of the world, and increase our export performance in that space. As part of the National Hydrogen Strategy, NEAR has been asked to support the establishment of a national hydrogen industry cluster. So we were quite keen on doing this from a point of being a leading source of knowledge and solutions in the world. We recently actually put out a report on growing Australia's oil and gas supply chains. It's quite disappointing in some ways that we've had about $400 billion of LNG investment, which has led us to be the world's leading LNG exporter over the last decade or so. And in Queensland, for example, about 30% of Australia's LNG comes out of Queensland. The first shipments, the first LNG wasn't produced until 2015. So we're very good at rapidly scaling an industry. But we haven't built potentially as large an LNG service economy that you would expect for potentially almost $500 billion of investment. Because hydrogen's still emerging, there's an opportunity for us to use all the great research we do here, the technology, the know-how, to actually form SMEs, to build their capabilities and capacity, to create collaboration, to build quality and scale and integrated offerings that we can actually plug into value chains around the world in hydrogen, where if it was a much more settled industry and people knew which technologies they were going to use and where things were going to happen, we may find it difficult to knock on those doors. But at the moment, no one really knows how this is going to play out and what combination of technologies are going to win through at the end. So it creates a great opportunity for our manufacturing sector and our services sector to play a big part in the hydrogen economy. We did 11 workshops, probably before a lot of the lockdowns started to happen. So we're quite fortunate to actually do face-to-face workshops in 11 locations across the country, about 250 stakeholders. We sort of see the national cluster coming together as a virtual cluster with regional clusters forming, where people can get together and they can potentially do place-based collaboration. It gives an opportunity to do that around hubs as well. I put H2SEQ on there. That's the kind of early start of a regional cluster for Southeast Queensland in hydrogen. There's a group of about 20 people that have come together to start looking at how they can grow the opportunity for themselves and for the industry and for their region. Just a few dot points there around where we think the hydrogen cluster will go next. Some of the timeframes have been put out a little bit, obviously through the extraordinary coronavirus pandemic that we're living through. But we're hoping that certainly by the end of the year we'll be in a position to launch the national cluster. But it's possibly likely by then there will be half a dozen regional clusters around the country that will be connected through that national cluster to provide a national alignment, a national narrative for the rest of the world, but also to get cluster-to-cluster collaboration happening as well. There's a number of clean tech and renewable clusters, and some great industry associations as well, Clean Energy Council, the Smart Energy Council, a lot of people working in this space. I just put a couple there. John O'Brien started the Australian Clean Tech Cluster probably a good dozen years ago, at least now, I think. The Victorian Clean Tech Cluster started, I think it was last year, might have been early last year or late the year before, around Southeast and New South Wales and Canberra. There's a Southeast region of renewable energy excellence. We've seeded the Australian Ocean Energy Group, looking at opportunities in particularly wave and tidal, but increasingly things like offshore wind as well, and leveraging our fantastic ocean resources. And Climate Kick and Energy Lab, I'm a mentor for Energy Lab through their current accelerator program, some great initiatives. This is really only just a small selection, so apologies for those that I've missed, but there really is a lot of activity in terms of building up the capability of some of our renewable energy technologists. And I don't know if people are following, but the Cooperative Research Centres, probably out of the last 10 cooperative research centres that have been named, 5 of them have been squarely in the energy space. So just in the last round, you saw the Future Energy Exports Cooperative Research Centre, which is both LNG and hydrogen related, to be funded, and also Reliable, Affordable, Clean Energy for 2030, or Race for 2030 CRC, which is very much around transforming parts of the Australian economy from an energy perspective. The previous year, the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre, which is both ocean energy, but also aquaculture and seafood, and Future Battery Industries probably speaks for itself, but that was in the 2019 round. And the previous year, 2018, the Future Fuels CRC was up. And altogether, just across those 5 centres, you've got over $1 billion in committed cash and in kind from government and from participants. So plenty going on in energy. And I guess one of the things we really want to see in the clusters is that we provide fantastic local commercial vehicles for some of the great IP that's going to be developed out of these CRCs. People will be well aware of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Irena. I mean, the figures are astounding. I've heard Clean Energy Finance Corporation talked about as the world's largest green bank. They've already, at the middle of last year, invested $7.2 billion out of their $10 billion. They've got a new $300 million advancing hydrogen fund, and Irena's invested just over $1.5 billion, and has just closed the funding round this last Tuesday, I think, for their $70 million renewable hydrogen deployment. So that was probably just a run through. No specific opportunities, business opportunities, but I think the third wave of renewable energy, which is going to have much more of an expert and export focus and much more of the green industrial focus, is going to be a very exciting time for Australia. I think it's going to help us maintain and grow our position as a global energy powerhouse. And I think at the moment we're a 350% energy economy, but I think there's every chance that we could be a 700% or 1,000% renewable economy, based on all the things that we've got going for us at the moment. So it's probably a really optimistic view, but that's probably what I'll leave it with, and hopefully we can have a great discussion. So thanks, Angus.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was a great overview. I'd like to ask Bob, take on board a question from Bob Pritchard, one of our good members, who's also the Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute. And I guess what probably Bob had in mind was the King Review, which is defining more of a technology neutral approach to the development of Australia's energy future. And he's asked the question, should we not perhaps be looking at this from the perspective of low emissions technologies rather than just referring specifically to renewables? I wondered if you've got a view on that, please.
Yeah, and I'm talking about renewables because the topic was renewables. But certainly and I must say I've worked in in clean technology, and I've worked in sustainability. I ran an innovation and sustainability consulting business. I worked for Greg Combayer as a senior advisor in innovation when we had a carbon price. What I tend to find is that we're much better off talking about, well, what is it we want to achieve, rather than talking about the tool we want to use. So I agree with Bob on that. We should talk about low emissions, but we've really got an advantage right across the country and right across our technologies and our natural resources to be able to give the world, not give ourselves, but give the world as well what's required. And if we can put the parameters around it and be clear about what it is we're trying to achieve, then let's have some competition across those different sources and different technologies to see what mix comes out at the end. But this comes up a lot when I go to regions, particularly regions that are heavy in coal and gas, and I actually say that this is a plus discussion. This is a diversification discussion. If we make it just a transition discussion, it becomes very polar. It becomes you're either for or you're against something. And for me, this is about energy diversification for Australia. And to be honest, if we end up with 1,000% renewable energy economy, with a great job growth and service economy and economic development in regions, then the slow decline potentially of fossil fuel sectors will be less impactful negatively for those regions. You know, you've got to give people a step to move to before you take an existing step away. So that's probably a roundabout way of saying yes, I agree. There's a whole range of different technologies. It's an exciting time in low emissions, and I you know, for better or for worse, tend to try to talk to everyone across the energy sector and champion the growth and the development and the low emission future that we're looking for.
Very good. Just a question. You referred to clusters. You also referred to hubs. For the benefit of the audience, could you explain the difference between a hub and a cluster?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Angus. In the National Hydrogen Strategy, Arup actually did a report on hubs for hydrogen. Now, a hub for hydrogen, for example, is somewhere where, say, for example, hydrogen is going to be produced, potentially it's going to be exported, and it's going to be done at scale. So that could be a Gladstone, it could be a Newcastle, it could be a Bell Bay, it could be any number of places around the country. And in fact, there was a very long list that Arup put together of hubs. A hub is likely to happen with foreign investment, with foreign technology, or any investment or technology if the market's there. The cluster doesn't actually just happen by default. So for example, if I take Gladstone in the LNG, so Gladstone had at least $60 billion, and there's probably it's probably almost approaching $100 billion now that's been spent on the coal seam gas to LNG pipe sort of value chain. But Gladstone doesn't have a large LNG service economy. It doesn't have a cluster. It has some fantastic individual companies, but it doesn't have a cluster of technologies that are servicing the LNG markets around the world. That has to be nurtured, that has to be designed, and that has to be supported. Otherwise, that bit doesn't happen. A hub is just a hub of production. That can be run with some construction projects, which provides a transitory economic or full economic perspective around employment. Once that's done, what's left behind, and what's left behind can be the cluster.
Thanks, Paul. Just we've got a question which I'd like to add to it. Thomas Padavani has asked the question, what will be the role of the cluster in the commercialisation of IP? Is there a platform to make contact with the research teams and build startups with both researchers and external founders? The added question I'd like to be for you to consider in addressing that question is that there is the existence of the CRCs, which are very much focused on research institutes rather than on individual companies. Do you think to be able to achieve the outcome requested in that question, there's a case that could be built that we have CRC type structures for clusters so the funding arrangements can be worked far more effectively than they do at the present moment?
Absolutely. I think, you know, we've had a few goes at clusters in Australia, but, you know, we look to places like Europe where there's 3,000 active clusters and a natural collaborative instinct. I think, you know, we have to go back to our sort of the last, you know, couple of hundred years of economic history of Australia, and look, we were reasonably isolated. We fought over regional markets within Australia, so we've got quite a local competitive spirit, probably too much, and that's right across from our politics to our business to our research environment. We compete still very much fiercely in that service economy in Australia. The idea of clusters is how do we bring them together, and how do we bring them together with researchers? We've been having some good discussions with some of particularly the new cooperative research centres about how do you build a cluster of SMEs and startups and technology companies around or by the side of a CRC. A CRC does some great industry engagement, but it's first and foremost to its partners and to the government, it's actually really got to run a research agenda. That's its first priority. It's got a number of themes. It's got some research programs that are ambitious, and they need to do that for a period. you know, one of the ones is, for example, the CRC for Blue Economy. We've looked at the CRC for Blue Economy. We'd seeded 2 clusters already. One was in ocean energy, as I talked about, and the other one was in subsea innovation. It's just got funding. Subsea Engineering Australia has just got funding to be an SME export hub. They provide a fantastic partnership for that CRC for Blue Economy to both provide pilot sites, to provide commercial vehicles for licensing, and to get industry feedback as well. So I think the idea is you create this, rather than a linear process, you create this ecosystem or this community, and hopefully that answers Thomas's question, is really you embed them in that environment so that rather than the researchers developing up something and then going looking for somewhere to license it, they've already been iterating with a community of people within a cluster that may actually help accelerate the commercialization and certainly make sure that it's ready for market.
With Thomas's focus on the commercialisation of IP in clusters, would it perhaps be not unreasonable to suggest that commercialisation could well be undertaken or initiated in CRCs where the industrialisation of these technologies becomes the role of the cluster rather than commercialisation per se?
Certainly, there's lots of different models of cluster, and I suspect they grow quite organically depending on the needs and the opportunities that are there. But what they provide in aggregate, and we all know that the alliance building, creating a group aggregation has huge benefits. It has huge benefits both ways for the early stage research and the IP generation. Potentially, clusters could actually be bidding for work as a consortium, or they could be holding or industrializing that IP, as you say. So there's lots of different ways they can go. They're all very early stage at the moment in Australia. We'd love to support them more and see them supported more. And we think with the hydrogen ones, we're in a really good point in a fast-growing industry that's still embryonic, that we've got an opportunity to get a larger slice for Australia.
Paul, looking at those sort of high-level strategic reasons, you've mentioned the growth centres, which are quite well defined around industry sectors, which begs the question whether those growth centres need to collaborate more effectively, say, for example, in the context of manufacturing, not being just an issue related to, for example, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, but has implications for advancements in those other centres. Do you think there's an opportunity, particularly looking at the opportunity for industry to engage, for the growth centre arrangements to be restructured?
I don't know about restructured. I mean, we do a lot of work with the other industry growth centres, and Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre is a great enabler. When I talked about the $400 billion that's been spent on the LNG infrastructure over the last decade or a little bit more, and potentially the supply chain and what we've done, there were great opportunities potentially for the manufacturing sector in Australia to get larger pieces of that work, but perhaps we didn't for some reason. So I think I think we should be manufacturing more in Australia. I think we should be doing more advanced manufacturing, advanced services. But I think where we're really going to have a strategic competitive advantage is where they're linked to areas where we've got almost an unfair competitive advantage. And renewable energy is one where we've pretty much got an unfair competitive advantage. We've got huge solar intensity, huge wind resources. We've got huge ocean resources. We've got a great range of things that we could do. If we can build a manufacturing sector off the back of that, that provides a real global advantage.
Thank you. Well, talking about our advantages, competitive advantages, Greg Porter has asked a question about the fact that whereas Australia mines most of the minerals required for battery production and exports them to China, where the batteries are manufactured, he's really asking what is the opportunity for Australia to get more value add on a larger scale so we can become a large scale producer of the world, and which also begs the questions about the role of batteries generally in this scale up that you've referred to in your presentation.
Yeah, sure. And look, I mean, batteries can be everything from something that goes into your watch, all the way up to large grid scale, lithium-ion systems or the like. So I think one of the things is for us to be cleverer about, rather than sort of talking in general about things like batteries, to actually work out what can we specialize in globally. We're unlikely to be able to knock out high volume, billions of batteries a year at small scale. But there are going to be applications, potentially in areas where high quality is important, where customization is important. Off the back of, for example, our world-leading ability to geographically disperse, PV panels. I'd love to see what we're doing in the grid scale batteries and the solar farm battery storage. If we're already going ahead in that, maybe they're the kind of batteries we should be doing. And the Future Battery Industries, CRC, is really looking at the whole supply chain, the whole circular economy of batteries. And they are really keen on building an industry here. I saw another announcement today about a battery manufacturing opportunity out of WA. I know there are some in Queensland as well. So I think we are growing off the manufacturing opportunities off the back of the energy sector.
And Paul, the interface with the electric vehicles and the reuse of batteries, is that becoming an important issue for that particular centre to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Future Battery Industries is looking at the whole circular economy of batteries. And I know there's some great work, I think, happening out of University of New South Wales. Apologies if I've got the university wrong, but looking at how we not only recycle and reuse batteries and battery materials, but also even things like PV panels. So we do have to look at the whole cycle of this. And from my sustainability, the life cycle assessment, the whole of life circular economy, it did seem to go out of vogue a bit, but it does seem to have come back a bit. Even the government's invested in a few resources in that way, and certainly I think it's helped us. It's sharpened our mind a little bit when other countries have decided not to take our waste anymore. I think we can build a whole industry off the back of that, and potentially even be taking waste from other countries in the region and processing their waste into secondary products, potentially at even higher value than the original products.
Mm-hmm. Paul, we've looking at the big picture type issues. Irena Yashin Shaw has asked a question. She says, "Thank you for the most informative presentation. She loves the idea of exporting sunshine. She heard Alan Finkel talk about this on Q&A on Monday evening, and it captured her imagination. Are you able to talk a little bit more about the actual nuts and bolts of this and the kinds of emerging technology that will enable this, please?"
Okay. Well, I think, a key part of it is going to be the scale of renewable energy generation. So, I mean, I remember, I'm based in Brisbane. I remember when the Aldoga renewable energy park or solar farm was announced for Gladstone. It was 250 megawatts, and that was massive scale. Now we're hearing about 10 and 15 and 20 gigawatt solar farms. And, I was at the Queensland Hydrogen Forum in Gladstone, where someone was talking about if we were providing renewable hydrogen to Japan in 2050 at the levels that they would want it from Australia, we would need 1,400 gigawatts of solar capacity to generate that much green hydrogen for export. So I think the key thing is actually the scale of renewable investment. We haven't seen anything yet. Is what I would say to that. So it's really that. If we're doing electrolysis, we're going to need water. We're going to need quite a lot of water. People will say, well, actually, we're a dry continent. We don't have a lot of fresh water. But I'm quite interested to see that people are looking at using wastewater, looking at tailings dams from mining, looking at seawater, looking at brine. And I think there was an announcement today of Hazer with the WA government looking at using the Hazer process for hydrogen production with wastewater in Perth. So I think the water, the energy plus water equals hydrogen, I think is, there's plenty of technologies, plenty of different approaches, and I think it's an exciting time.
Jeff, thanks, Paul. Jeff Sterling talked about the large investment in gas development. He's asking a question about that you mentioned, and that the export has not delivered the potential ongoing support that industry could supply. What do you see should be changed to try and get a better outcome as we move forward?
I think that probably goes to the heart of the work that we've just done on looking at growing Australia's oil and gas supply chains, but also, you know, a bit of a reflection on that LNG boom that happened over the last decade. And, you know, we didn't build the service economy that we would have liked, I suspect, for a number of reasons. Ironically, I think one of the challenges we get stuck in is when we think about local manufacture, local services, we get into a local content discussion. And local content often means we end up with quite low value, locally competitive services that get delivered to a project. But that becomes a kind of a finite project. It's a construction project. At one point, there were 14,500 construction workers on Curtis Island building 3 LNG plants. But once those construction projects were gone, they disappeared out of town. They went probably back into other parts of the domestic construction industry. We didn't leverage it. I think one of the key things I'd like to see is that we work out what are the aspects that we, yes, should be importing technology, we should be importing capital. They are going to just be involved in developing it. And then what are the ongoing servicing, procurement kind of opportunities that we can actually do as an advantage here that we can do for those local projects, but we can also then leverage into global markets. And potentially the way we work with the financiers and the operators of those projects is to actually, rather than saying, please meet a local content rule, it's actually saying, you know, let's work with you on what are the things that could actually fill your global value chain that you could help us partner with in Australia, and use those local investments to actually generate the capability and capacity in our local supply chains, so that we're actually building the cluster, we're building the service economy in parallel to the major projects going ahead.
Very good. We haven't discussed COVID-19 yet, but we did get a question sent in advance in respect of the current pandemic. The question from Shujant Tamhani, excuse me if I have mispronounced your name, but Shujant has asked the question: what impact and challenges arising from the pandemic do you foresee in the short term, she says next 1 to 3 years, and in the longer term?
Great question. I wish I knew definitively the answer on that. But what I think becomes really important is actually governments around the world are going to be stimulating their economies a lot more than they even did after the GFC. We've seen a change in Europe, particularly after the GFC. There was what they called austerity. What they're really looking to do is to stimulate economic activity coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I must say, we're not anywhere near out of the COVID-19 pandemic yet. Apparently vaccines, mass test and tracing are still some time off. But if you look at the EU is really doubling down on its emissions reduction. It put out a plan this week around a very green recovery. So it was going to invest more in renewable technologies, more into hydrogen, more into renewable energy. So I think, you know, you know, we may see more of that, but we haven't yet seen, I guess, from Australia and from other economies what the mix of investments will be. But the adage can sometimes be, let's not waste a good crisis. There's an opportunity to do transformation that may be very difficult to do when things are just swimming along nicely.
Paul, in other sectors in Australia, there's been suggested that one of the ongoing impacts of COVID will be rapid digital transformation in the way that people interact. Do you have any comments on that will relate to the cluster development concepts you've been talking about?
Absolutely, and we're already seeing it. We're part of one of the things, and we often hear that Australia is a high cost economy, and I go, well, absolutely we are, because we're also an advanced economy. We've got high standards of living generally, notwithstanding that we do have growing, or we do have economic inequity in some ways. But if you look at GDP per capita, we're a high cost economy. We're a high lifestyle economy. One of the things that often happens out of those sort of places that we're really good, and because we've got such a large geographic landmass, we're quite well advanced on robotics and automation, remote operations, machine learning, artificial intelligence. And what I think is really exciting to see is things like the growth of the Australian space industry is leveraging off a lot of other sectors and capability. So out of Western Australia, there's the Arose cluster that's forming around remote operations space and the resource industries. In some ways, the way we've done mining, oil and gas, the way we've done agriculture in Australia, in very harsh environments sometimes, a long way from population centres. We've had to be very clever about operating and automating as well. And it's about how we can potentially leverage those into other sectors. So yes, the automation, digitisation, it's going to be really interesting to see urban environments now when people can potentially work from home a lot more. People are used to using tools like Zoom, they're comfortable with it. You know, we're in for a transformation. I think we've known these tools exist for quite a while, but it's really only now that we're having this intensive process of learning how to use them, and I think the world will change because of that. So yeah, so those things will probably accelerate as well. And there's things like artificial intelligence being used now to match solar farms to energy demand as well. So there's a lot of that happening as well, about really matching supply and demand in the energy sector so that you don't get huge surpluses or risks of blackouts.
I think that answers Suzanne's second question, but the third question she had in mind was the opportunity for new Australian Indigenous startups, and we assume we're talking about Indigenous people being involved in startups in the space as it relates to government funding, engagement challenges, etc. Any comments you'd like to make on that, Paul?
I don't know specifically about Indigenous startup funding, but I do know that there is a lot of support for startups out there, and I'd be happy to provide some links or have a further discussion one-on-one about what that looks like. I mentioned Irena and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. There is some really great funding that goes through people like the Entrepreneurs Program with the Accelerating Commercialisation funding, the Cooperative Research Centre, not just the CRCs themselves, but the Cooperative Research Centre projects, or CRCPs, up to $3 million of funding. There is a lot of funding and support schemes, and we're happy to talk to Sushant about what might specifically be available for them.
Fine, thank you. As we draw into the end of the 1 hour session, Paul, just one final question from me, please. The title of the presentation was Australian Business Opportunities from Renewable Energy, and you've certainly outlined a lot of the big picture, the actual means of moving into that for business might be a little bit hard for a lot of companies and investors to consider. What advice would you like to offer to people who are wishing to get into the business? Where should they start and who should they contact?
I think a really key part for any business is to really understand your strengths and your capabilities, and also what's your level of ambition. And then I think it's really talking to existing customers, talking to markets, networking, joining events, looking at some of the accelerators, scale-up accelerators, for example, joining industry associations, getting involved in discussions about what might be the opportunities for me. Is there some capability or some skill that I have or I could rapidly acquire? Is there some partnerships that I could build with universities, with others? There's lots of people to talk to. I'm constantly talking to people about making connections, and I'd be happy to, anyone that's participating would be happy to have a conversation about a funding scheme, a partnership opportunity, an introduction to a potential customer or site partner. etc. The real question would be that you're not doing this on your own. There is a world of opportunity out there, and there's lots of support available for which is not just funding, but potentially it can just be a little bit of mentoring or coaching, or providing some signposting to some valuable initiatives.
Well, thank you, Paul. We've reached 5 o'clock. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you on behalf of Reinvent Australia for sharing your vision and also explaining in a very effective summary the range of opportunities, the structures are in place, and certainly the indication through the mechanisms of clusters which you've explained, which enabled individuals and companies to collaborate. And clusters are great for that. Thank you very much for devoting the time and also making the offer available to assist any of the people who've attended this presentation to get in contact with you. That's very much appreciated.